2009 through to 2014, maybe 2008, I'm 100% sure. My faith was in a really bad place. I had questions that I couldn't answer and problems that I felt personally I couldn't ignore, even though it would be really convenient for me to have ignored them. In fact, one person, my sister, I won't tell you which one, gave me some really excellent counsel. She said, just lie. Rahab did. I guess biblical evidence. So. It wasn't a lot of fun. It certainly wasn't very easy. And there are essentially two things that kind of kept me alive from a faith perspective, even though the beats were probably a bit intermittent at times. The first thing was I was convinced that the tomb was empty. And I hung on to that for grim death. And the second thing was there was this country called Israel. And whilst you could give all sorts of historical explanations as to why they existed, it seemed pretty obvious that God was somewhere behind them pulling the strings. Those two faint little pieces really were the safety net. And I had people, not my sister, who encouraged me to walk away. But no, just leave the community. Be honest with yourself, get out. And they were people once I thought were friends. It was pretty tough. It took a lot of time for me. I read a lot of books. I watched a lot of YouTube talks and things. I did a fair bit of thinking. I argued with a lot of people because if you're unfortunate enough to have too much interaction with Edgecombe's, good morning, no one's not, let's fight about it. But that's partly how I learn and reason things through. You know, you can't all agree around the dinner table, even if you think it's probably right. You really should argue the point, because no one else is. So that was part of me, you know, trying to go through and resolve things. And I'm not necessarily a quick learner, and I changed my mind slowly, much to the frustration of my wife, and particularly my children. It took no time. Some of my opinions that I hold today are probably wrong, and I hope I change them over the next little while. Some of them are probably very uncomfortable for a lot of people here. But, you know, he's odd, but some of his opinions are kind of offensive. But as a congregation, we value truth, we value faith, and we value growth. And that means that we see fellowship about sharing Jesus' table, not protecting it. We think about growing our faith in our congregation, not guarding it against perceived threats. And they're really important mindset differences. Because growth means accepting difference. And it also means accepting those who are in a crisis and whose faith is at a different point in life to ourselves. Because from time to time, almost all of us are going to face a crisis of faith. Sometimes we might just keep hitting them time after time. There might be some lucky person who just sails on through, never feeling challenged, and to that person I say that's incredible. You're really blessed. Wish I was more like you. But the challenge of faith that most of us will experience can lead to growth or it can lead to disaster. And it really depends on how that's managed, how we manage it ourselves, and also how we as a congregation, as friends, as family, how we deal with the person who's having that faith challenge. That's critical. Sarah's not here, so I can talk about it. It's been recorded. Change that. Sarah came downstairs one day, many years ago, and found me on a Saturday morning. I won't tell you what the time was, but she does keep princess hours on the weekend. And just found me weeping over my keyboard. And it was because I had found other people who nearly shared my opinion and definitely shared my questions. And suddenly I felt like I wasn't completely alone, like I wasn't some sort of freak. I found that the answers that those people had didn't necessarily satisfy me, but at least I had someone, some people that I could start to bounce off and explore and try and rebuild things a little for myself. Now I'm nervous about this talk, personally. Because we all know people whose faith is faint, flickering, or maybe there's a little disturbing flat line in hospital. And maybe we know people who are waiting for the defibrillator. I'm sure I can say that word right. Abby tried to teach me how to say the word. The defib Kickstarter thing. We know people who are waiting for Jesus and the angels to apply the defib to restart their faith. So this is probably a little less theoretical in some ways that I perhaps am comfortable in, but I was the fool who chose this subject, so I've got no right. But because, I like theories, I like ideas, I guess this is kind of a model that we'll sort of be using a little bit to talk about. Was I the genius that invented it? Heck no. It's kind of patched together from different people. James Hayward is one of the people who had some input into it, unbeknownst to him. It's a model. I did a bit of economics through my uni degree, loved it. They give you a model, it's the answer to everything. Just really get into it. It's great. And then after 3 weeks, they'll tell you why that didn't work. Kind of really frustrating. So please, this is not a medical prescription. It's a way of talking about some ideas and it's not perfect. So if you see that and can punch holes in it, well done. And we've only got 45 minutes, not weeks. So what basically is it trying to say? Well, most of us, we start in our faith and hopefully we often spend a lot of time in our faith in that sort of settled position on top. We're comfortable, we're emotionally stable, we have a construction of faith and understanding that works for us, right? And it's consistent with how we're finding life and it's great. It's better than okay, it's great. And if we could stay there forever, it would be fantastic. But often in life, a crisis occurs. Something happens. And our faith is challenged. We can feel confused, we can feel bereaved, because it feels like our faith has failed. The answers that we had, that we believed in, aren't working in this circumstance, or don't seem to work well enough to explain. Now often that's, a loss, it might be the death of someone, it might be illness, it might be some sort of circumstance. We go, well, I just can't marry this practical experience with what I know God is like. And it's not working for me anymore. We can be shocked. We can be fearful. Because I think it's fair to say most of us would be afraid of losing our faith. That's tough. We can then kind of do one or two things. We could slip back into that happy, settled state. We could bury the problem and hope it doesn't eat away at us from the inside, or maybe the challenge goes away and fades, right? The doctors do their thing and everything gets better, if it's a medical purpose. Or maybe we move into this deconstruction phase. If we're in deconstruction, well, this is the crisis. This is when we accept the fact that our faith, as we understand it, doesn't work right now. Our understanding of God doesn't match the circumstances. We can't reconcile these things. Painful place to be. We might dig in and start asking why. We might start having some pretty tough conversations with God. We read Habakkuk 1 this morning. Often there's anger, there's depression, isolation. Because everyone else is fine. It's just me. Hopefully, that leads to a rebuilding phase. Hopefully we start to find some answers. We reconstruct a new model of faith, something that works better with the circumstances. And that can be a deeply satisfying part of the cycle. As we get, we can get really spiritually engaged at that point, excited. Other people might be looking at us going, "It's solving a problem that doesn't exist," but it does for us. And we're sort of coming out of this, the deconstruct phase, and we're rebuilding a faith that works. Now, often it's associated with a faith or answers which perhaps accept a greater level of complexity and uncertainty in life than we originally had. But there's often a newfound wholeness and satisfaction as we move back to that settled phase. And hope we don't have to go through that again. Unfortunately, we don't always get there. People don't always get there, not straight away at any rate. And it's quite possible for us, for people when they're in that sort of deconstruction, questioning, it's not working struggle to climb up to rebuild. Get stuck in a cycle of deconstruction, of cynicism, of anger, a loss of faith. Let's talk about this a little bit and what it means, I guess, in practice for us. Let's talk about that idea of settled faith, faith of peace. Now, I'm not suggesting that any of this is that a settled faith is inferior, right? It's a model, right? It's not factual. It's just a model for us to think about. I might have a problem with your settled faith position. Right? Let me give you an example. Right? Here's a faith position I'd go, nah. Okay? I once was young, now I'm old. I've never seen a godly man abandoned, or children forced to search, children of the righteous forced to search for food. Psalm 37, verse 25, NET. Anyone think that's true? Don't put your hands up. Does anyone think that's true? Godly's never abandoned? Their children never beg for bread? I mean, we could take an attitude and say, that's incredible. That is so amazing and brilliant that Brother David, that dewy-eyed, naive, innocent Brother David, that's bad, has his life experience. He can actually genuinely say that. That's part of his faith. Right? That's how he understands God, and that's great. We could be a little dismissive. Mate, I've been around the block a few times. That's not how life works. I could be a little bit cynical. I could probably pour a little bit of, zero? Some sort of herbicide or something on his faith. That's not the right thing to do, is it? Yet Paul issues a stern warning to the Romans, the Gentiles in Rome, because they were very tempted to sort of sit back and go, well, you know what, I've got a superior understanding of grace. I've got deeper philosophical knowledge than you do, Brother Jew. I've got a certain worldly realism that you need to catch up with, meet off the title, whatever. What does Paul say to that? They wanted to wave around their better understanding of God, their more nuanced position. Paul says, hold the bus. Romans 14, verse 1. Receive the one who is weak in faith, according to your so superior position. Receive the one who's weak in faith, and don't have disputes over differing opinions. You think that their settled faith, is perhaps a little naive, got a little bit of growth to do? Great. Zip it. My father would love it when I say. In fact, he goes on to say in Romans 14, verse 22, the faith that you have, keep it to yourself before God. What does it mean? Keep your faith to yourself. We're meant to go out and tell everyone about our faith. No, he's saying, you think your faith is superior, more nuanced, certainty is just a whole lot broader and better than this simplistic, I've never seen the righteous begging bread. Zip it. Be respectful of other people's faith, but don't you go thinking that your position is, a little bit superior because you've been around the wheel and had to reconstruct your faith. Might think that that's sort of David's attitude, going out preaching that to young people. I mean, that's just putting stumbling blocks in the path of the young. I mean, tell all these kids, okay, kids, you are never going to see any good person suffer ill. I don't think that's a wise thing to teach. Right? But Paul says, Daniel, you take your view on faith, and you be very careful with how you interact with other people. Don't you go stamping on somebody else's faith position. Right? We can learn from each other, absolutely. But we need to be very careful. Right? We need to be cognizant of that warning from Paul about how we interact with each other. So please understand if I say anything this morning that you think, it's pushing it a bit. Just sorry. Okay. Happy to talk about that and be better corrected afterwards. Faith gets challenged. Now we know that Jesus will help us when we're weak in faith. One of my favourite passages, the father who comes to Jesus with a child that's got epilepsy and says, can you heal my child? Jesus says, sure, if you believe. And the father says, I believe, but help my unbelief. Right? I think it's one of the rawest, most honest things in Scripture. Mark 9. And Jesus goes ahead and heals the child. But that's not what always happens, is it? I mean, sometimes we take things to the Lord in prayer and it gets worse. That's not what's meant to happen. But it does. And we see scriptural examples of this. Luke 8. Jairus comes because his daughter's sick, dying, and says, Lord, can you help my little girl? And Jesus is too busy. We pray to God and say, I've got this problem and I need help. And you watch over here as Jesus does something in somebody else's life, and your problem gets worse. Jairus' daughter dies because Jesus is helping someone who frankly wasn't the best, most socially acceptable person anyway. Jesus prioritised them. My kid died. That'll do things to your faith. Now, of course, in Luke 8, it was all fine and Jesus went and raised Jairus' daughter. That doesn't always happen either. I mean, Psalm 44, you know that you've got a faithful community and they say, Lord, we're like sheep getting slaughtered all the day long. We believe, we're faithful, and it's just not working out. I don't know how lambs feel on Australia Day, but this is where these people work. Alright? Our faith can take a hammering from real life. Challenges can happen. Sometimes the response to those challenges doesn't seem to make sense. So we can deconstruct, and we might have to try and rebuild. Now I'll take an example of Job. We know the story of Job. Talking with someone and they said, well, yeah, of course, but it might actually just be a theological play. It's like, yep, that's true. May well be. But all the message and the point still stands, regardless of whether we see it as history or a teaching performance. What do we see in Job? Well, I think Job shared the same position as his friends. He thought if you were good or you were bad, God would intervene. You know, you'd get your reward or you'd get your just desserts. That's how things work. That's how God operates. And that just wasn't true. And Job found that out the hard way. He started this incredible suffering. But he didn't sin when it all went south, right? Remember he said his wealth is stripped away, his children are killed. He said, well, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. He didn't sin with his mouth, says the record. But how did Job feel? Right? How did he actually feel? Well, here's some words that Job says. Yeah, not hard to see how his faith is holding up, how his understanding of God is holding up. He cursed the day he was born. He wished that he died at birth in Job chapter 3. He wanted death, he repeats several times. God was unfair. Job 7. If I've sinned, what have I done to you, O watcher of men? Why have you set me as your target? Have I become a burden to you? Why? God's justice made no sense. It's all one. That's why I say he destroys the blameless and the guilty. It's not what Job thought coming into this. Certainly not what his friends thought. But now he's looking going, well, it's just fact. I didn't see him before. He wanted to talk to God because his friends have no answers. In Job 13, I wish to speak to the Almighty. I desire to argue my case with God. Not to sort of respectfully request, I want to argue this out with God. And your friends, you said you're a bunch of inventors of lies, worthless positions. It's one of the most brilliant put downs in the scripture. But he wants to get face to face with God and argue his case. He felt deserted. He felt attacked by God unfairly. God has wronged me. He's encircled me with his net. He was frustrated that he couldn't find God. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, he says, that I could come to his place of residence. I'd lay out my case before him. I'd fill my mouth with arguments. Right? Job wants to have a trial. He wants to get to God's front door and have it out. Explain what's going on. God denied him justice. He's made my life bitter, Job 27. He's very confident that he was a good man and that he was unfairly treated. That's very clear in Job 31. That's some pretty serious deconstruction. That's a man who's seriously frustrated that all of the answers he had didn't work, and he couldn't understand why. Why was God doing this to him? How is this possible with what he knew of God? Where's God's justice? Where's God's fairness? He once thought he knew, but there was no reason for his suffering. And all of his friends that came in to try and help, they just proved that everything that Job previously thought was wrong, because their arguments were clearly ridiculous. Like they just failed to take the facts test. You know, Job thought he was alone while he was sitting on the ash heap, waiting for his friends to turn up. He probably felt like he was no longer alone when they sat there for 7 days without saying a word. How alone do you think he felt when they actually opened their blinking mouths? He felt more lonely then than when he was waiting for them to turn up. And when we go through, that sort of cycle of challenge, deconstruction and reconstruction, we feel really lonely. Job certainly did. Rather than have his friends actually sit down and engage in the facts, his friends just wanted to defend their existing position. They didn't really care with what Job was going through so much. It was more important to them to defend their faith. And they were happy to sell him down the river. You must be wicked. They knew he wasn't. You must be wicked. Because I'd rather declare you wicked than have to face the questions that you're facing. Good way of thinking about Job's friends and our role in other people's challenges. They needed to meet him where he was with the facts that he had, and perhaps also step back a little from their pre-existing opinions. What was the rebuild for Job? What was God's answer? Well, we know that God restored Job double, right? Gave him twice as many donkeys, twice as many camels, and I'd be horrified if I had all these donkeys. But that was a good thing for Job, and he felt genuinely blessed. Had all of Job's prayers been answered? He's still got 10 dead children. I know a guy who must be hay fever. I know a guy who lost a child and was well over 20 years ago, and you just don't talk to him for that week. Always at home. Kind of think that Job was given an answer. He always prayed about his kids, didn't he? Always worried that his kids had left. Maybe God gave an answer to Job. I'd like to think so. But what about the big questions? Why? Why did this all happen? I mean, great, I've got lots of donkeys running around the paddock again. But why did I go through this? How does that work with who you are? That's what Job wanted to know. Now, at first blush, it kind of seems like God's answer to Job is, my ways are really complicated, and I'm much more powerful than you, so just hold the questions. I don't quite think that's what God is saying. Job doesn't think he can get an answer. Job thinks he got an answer. Sorry, speak up. Job thought he got an answer. If you look in Job chapter 42, verse 5, he says, I've heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now I've seen you face to face. Through all that experience and pain, Job's conclusion is, now I actually understand. Now I've seen you. Now I've got a personal experience of you. I mean, previously I believed, but maybe it was a bit of an inherited faith that he'd been brought up with, that he'd grown up with. Now he's got a face-to-face personal understanding and connection of God. You know, once he thought good and bad fortune was a direct result of God. He saw God as, the ever-present policeman. And within 3 months, maybe it was 2 weeks, not sure what the time frame was, every good deed would be rewarded and every bad deed would be punished. God was like Santa Claus and the evil twin all in one guy. he now realises that's not who God is. It's not how life is. He knows that. But he understands that's not what God was ever doing. God has established a system which he designed to work, and he's not accountable to human demands for immediate justice. Job thought he was. I was like, no, I'm not that small, Job. I'm bigger than that. God was working to his plan, his timeline, not Job's. So the reconstruction is complete, right? Job's gone round the wheel. Started quite happy and settled. He's gone through the challenge, the deconstruction, and now the reconstruction. And now he's restored. He's restored with the community and with his friends. He feels at peace. He feels blessed. His faith has changed. I would suggest for the better. James chapter 5 says, you've heard of Job's endurance, or patience, depending on which version you've got. It's called patient endurance. I'll switch between the two words. You've heard of the patience of Job, and you've seen the Lord's purpose. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Job teaches us, sure, about God's final purpose, blessing. But on the way through, how long do you think the process took with Job from the first time the camels were taken off and then eventually the kids and then the restoration? How long do you think it took? It wasn't that quick. And why does James say the patience or the endurance of Job? Mum, how much further? Dad, why are we still in the car? Dad, can we stop now? There's some hackers there, Dad. Dad, Mum, where's the playground? Dad, how much further to Sydney? Mum said it was close. Dad, that sign said Mount Barker. Are we nearly there? Flippin' heck. You're not calling that kid patient, are you? But when you read through the book of Job, Job's continually asking God questions. I'm not suggesting he's quite the whiny kid in the car. So how could you call him patient, enduring? Well, the one thing that Job didn't do is he didn't run away, he didn't walk away from his faith. He was prepared to stick it out and keep asking the questions, keep exploring. I think that's how you'd say he endured. Right. He certainly didn't ignore the questions, he certainly didn't express his feelings. He didn't freak out that his friends were clueless, which, well, he did a little bit, but it didn't cause him to walk away. He didn't give up on God. People told him to. Real early in the piece. His wife told him to. Curse God and die. Just give it up. Clearly, your faith doesn't work. We're all wrong. Give it up. But Job patiently endured. He refused to give up on God, even though he had some pretty tough questions. We want fast answers. Job teaches us to hang in with the questions. Lucy talked about that sort of Selah moment, sitting, thinking, being in the moment, sitting with big questions, and being patient with those around us. The Job's wife example, probably not a great one, and even his friends. Pretty good clues as to how we could do better with people who are trying to hang on. Let's take another example, Habakkuk. Habakkuk was probably a temple prophet, temple musician, right? And we get that kind of by, in Habakkuk chapter 3, it's clearly a psalm and it's got musical instructions and stuff around it. So let's just assume that he is, because otherwise the entire talk falls over. All right, so when was Habakkuk operating? Probably he started off in the reign of Josiah. What's the reign of Josiah like? Well, if you're a temple prophet musician, it's an awesome time to be alive. Because you've got this amazing reformer, right? You've got this king, he starts at 8 years old, he's in the line of David, and the Davidic promises are just going off like firecrackers in the back of your head as he cleans up the temple, he does the Passover, he gets rid of the idols, it goes right through the land, full of zeal, and it's fantastic. And everything's starting to tick, everything click, everything's coming together, right? I mean, you live for the promises to David, and they are literally just happening in front of you with this son of David. Great times. Now, who's 39 years old here? Andrew Quixley! I think you've an experienced 39-year-old. Ben is also. So, young Ben, he's 39 years old. He's in the prime of his life. Those of you who are about to get there a second time round can probably testify to that. Josiah was 39 years old when he headed north to the fortress of Megiddo, which stands over the narrow pass into the Jezreel Valley. And coming along the seacoast road, then pulling a right-hand turn to go through the Jezreel and up north to Assyria and intervene. Josiah decides he'll intervene and try and chop off the Egyptians at Megiddo, and he gets killed in the prime of his life, 39. Right, the great Davidic king. And here's Habakkuk as a temple prophet who's just seen the nation improve spiritually. Let's do it this way for you. Out of sight. What comes next? Well, King Jehoiakim was pretty much next on the throne, son of Josiah. He was put in place by Necho. He was a puppet king. And then later on the Babylonians come along, take over, and they say, yeah, you can keep going there, pull the strings. The whole place gets put under tribute. Jehoiakim whacked massive taxes on everywhere. He was corrupt. Jeremiah 22 verse 13 says he was building luxury dwelling places like houses with cedar panelling and jag kitchens, marble bench tops, the whole 9 yards, right? And everyone else is suffering under the burden of taxation to pay the tribute. There was no justice. In Jeremiah 22, a prophet stood up against him. Jeremiah 26, sorry. A prophet stood up against him and condemned him, felt threatened, fled to Egypt. So he sent a bunch of commandos down to Egypt, kidnapped the prophet, dragged him back to Jerusalem and killed him. It's Jehoiakim. Now you've gone from Josiah to this violent, oppressive, murderous, wicked king. Life has turned upside down. You're brought up on the promises to David. You live and breathe the worship of God in the temple. And now this has happened in your life. God's destroyed your world. And so Habakkuk takes it to God and complains bitterly. And we read that with Leon this morning. Violence. Why don't you do something, God? It's completely and absolutely ridiculous. Intervene. And God says, verse 4 through verse 11, okay, I will. I'm going to bring in the Babylonians. And Habakkuk says, well, that's absolutely ridiculous. What a stupid idea. Not only, that's wrong. He tells God, point blank, that's wrong. Look what he says, verse 12. You're too pure to look upon evil. How can you possibly do this? That's just not right. Right? His understanding of God says that's impossible. I think it's hilarious that we quote this verse sometimes, God's too pure to look upon evil and all the rest of it. And it's like, in context, this is a prophet telling God, you're wrong. And we quote it as if it's correct. He's arguing with God, and this is his point against God, so it's probably not a great place to stand. Habakkuk is arguing with God. That is inconsistent with your character. You're in the wrong. He's objecting to God's plan. His understanding of God doesn't match God's promised reality. Now, God will resolve this for him, kind of. In chapter 2, God says, well, things will eventually turn out okay for the righteous. The Babylonians will eventually get their just deserts. Eventually I will be established as king over all the earth, and all will keep silence before me while I reside in my holy temple. It's all going to happen. But Habakkuk, as the temple prophet, as the believer in the Davidic promises, well, he expects a Josiah-like king to come now, and to God to operate in certain ways. And God clearly is not going to operate in the ways Habakkuk expects. Which is why Habakkuk has it out. You know, chapter 2 verse 1, he says, I'm just going to stand on the ramparts, I'm going to go and stand on the city walls, cross my arms, and wait for God to answer. He's in an argument with God. Because God's not doing the things that he expects. He's in a crisis of faith. And the deconstruction is obvious. Ask for God's aid, God makes it worse. It's all broken. His faith model is broken. The reconstruction for Habakkuk, God says, well, okay, it's going to come, but just not yet. And it required Habakkuk to retool his faith. And in chapter 3, we see Habakkuk's recovery. You can have a look at chapter 3. We're not going to talk about it in a lot of detail because time. But essentially, Habakkuk gives this psalm. And what does the psalm say? There's 3 stanzas. There's lots of interesting things. Got a minor point of interest. Habakkuk initially, in chapter 1, verse 2, says, I cry to you, and you don't listen. After he's gone through the deconstruction and he's now reconstructing. If you look in chapter 3, verse 2, Habakkuk's changed direction. I've heard what you said. Chapter 3, verse 16, I listen, I hear the promise that you're making. Right? Habakkuk has retooled his faith somewhat. And how does he do it? What is the basis of Habakkuk's rebuilding and refining of his faith, of his confidence in God? How does he anchor his new understanding? Well, he anchors it in the Exodus. And if you read through Habakkuk chapter 3, he's imagining God like as this warrior king marching for his people through the wilderness via the Exodus route. Right? He's re-seeing. So he's hanging on to that historical piece. Okay, so my understanding of how God should operate today, now, doesn't work. But I know this is true. Alright? It's like I said at the start. An empty tomb, that was my Exodus. For Habakkuk, well, it was the Exodus. That's what he hung on to. I know that's true. So I now need to rebuild how from there, how I get to where I am today. And what the facts of my life in faith are now. And what does he conclude? Verse 16 onwards. I listened, my stomach churned, the sound made my lips quiver, my frame went limp as if my bones were decaying. I shook as I tried to. I longed for the day of distress to come upon the people who attack us. I'm weak, I'm waiting for deliverance. I can't see it. I can't see it. Verse 17, when the fig tree doesn't bud, when there's no grapes on the vines, when the olive trees don't produce, the fields yield no crops, everything is awful. It's completely not what David was talking about. The righteous don't go hungry. Habakkuk's not seeing that. Everything's going to fail. When the sheep disappear from the pen, there's no cattle in the stalls. I will rejoice because of the Lord. I will be happy because of God who delivers me. I will keep on believing despite the suffering. Despite the fact this doesn't match what I thought it should. In verse 19, a bit of a tricky verse to translate. The NET puts it this way. The sovereign Lord is my source of strength. He gives me the agility of a deer. He enables me to negotiate a rugged terrain. Habakkuk believes God acted in the past. And he trusts that God will again. Oh, he wants it now. But now he accepts that things are going to be more difficult, not less. And he's going to hold on to the Exodus as a foundation, a resurrection type point for him. But his reconstructed faith is what? If I had to sort of put it in a short sentence. God doesn't make the path easy, but he helps me navigate until it's God's time. I think that's Habakkuk's faith after. Not what it was to start with. So he's going to rejoice despite the trouble, because he now understands God's plan is going to evolve a little slower than he thought. Uncertainty is the new certainty. Once a faith is reconstructed or in that process, it's different. For those of you who have got brilliant eyes, you can read this small text that someone graffitied on the wall. For those of you who can't, it says, what I'm saying is uncertainty is the softest strength. That's pretty good. Uncertainty is the softest strength. Was Job's theology as simple and as certain after his experience? No. It wasn't as black and white as it was. Was Habakkuk's request neatly answered? Did he see the Davidic Messiah there and then? No, he didn't. In each case, there was a paradigm shift in their thinking. You know, God moves in mysterious ways. God's timeline, God's plan, it's different to what we perhaps would expect or hope. Each of them had less certainty about how or when God would work, but they had a more resilient model of faith. And I think that's the really valuable thing, a more resilient model of faith. More grey, more nuance, and probably a lot more patience. So, if you're in hospital, don't let go. If we're sitting in the deconstruction phase, there's a significant risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Because we're challenged, we toss everything. I don't understand God turns into I don't believe in God. It's very easy, but those two things are not actually the same. And we need to be patient and kind to ourselves to draw that distinction. How do we cope? Well, look at Job. Patient endurance. We don't need to be able to answer every question immediately. We need to accept sometimes that well-meaning friends might not necessarily be helpful. Sitting with the big questions like Job did is important to coming out the other side. We don't need to make a snap decision to believe or bail. We just don't. Habakkuk. Well, he couldn't rationalise the current experience. He couldn't rationalise what God was going to do next. He could concur with God's past activity, the Exodus. He could wait, despite how uncomfortable it was. A friend of mine said many years ago, if you accept the resurrection, the rest is just detail. Now, we need to be careful with that comment. We don't take it wildly out of context, because if the detail is tremendous personal, physical suffering, it feels like it's pretty important. But he was talking more about theology and understanding and trying to make things work in our faith model. Hang on to the resurrection. Hang on to the big facts of the past like Habakkuk did. Right? Maybe we can sort the rest out over time. We don't need every answer right now. Psalm 73 has a man who is in tremendous theological trouble. He was a man whose faith was being absolutely hammered. Why? Well, he says, Psalm 73 verse 2, as for me, my feet almost slid out from underneath me because, verse 13 to 19, the wicked have a great time. They're super prosperous, they have nicer boats, better cars, and their gardens are always mowed. Right? Probably their laundry's all done. Everything works. Right? What's the point of being righteous? It's hard, and it should be simpler. In vain have I kept my motives pure and maintained a pure lifestyle. I suffer all day long and punished every morning. Right? What I understand of God just isn't true. And he suffered without sharing his concerns because he thought he might drag others down. Hopefully we've got a little more confidence in those around us, and that confidence is deserved. But the critical thing with the psalmist in Psalm 73 is that, like Job, like Habakkuk, he didn't bail on his faith when he had questions. He hung in there. He came along even though, honestly, he probably felt like a hypocrite. But eventually, a penny dropped. Psalm 73 verse 17, then I entered the precincts of God's temple and I understood the destiny of the wicked. It didn't happen immediately. He just kept on keeping on for some time, trying to sit with these questions, trying to churn it through. You know, don't let go. Hang in waiting for answers. They may come. Yeah, one way perhaps of thinking about it might be to rethink faith. What do I mean by that? When we talk about faith, almost programmed, we go to Hebrews 11, we go to David facing down Goliath, we go to, these heroes of faith, right? People who do incredible things. Someone gave me an idea a way back. I thought it was scandalous at the time because I just wasn't ready to hear it. So if you're scandalised, sorry. Eventually I found it really quite helpful, but at the time I was scandalised, so if you are, okay. But we have this internal definition of what faith should be, right? We have this definition of there's a minimum bar, and if I don't get over that bar, I'm not faithful. That might be right or wrong, but I'm telling you, it's probably not helpful. Particularly if someone's going through a serious challenge and reconstructing or trying to deconstruct and build again. So maybe here's some low bars if you or someone around you is struggling to hang on, struggling just to wait for later answers. Maybe I'm not sure Jesus is the Son of God. But can I hang around because I think Jesus had some incredible lessons, teachings. I'm not sure about the kingdom. Okay. Can you agree that you're dissatisfied with the world as it is? Let's just rest there for a moment. I'm not sure I can believe in God. Okay. It's tough. Can we agree that we believe in good? I have to come here to worship God. Can we redefine that maybe if we need to? I come here trying to find God. I love being here with Jesus. Can't hit that bar. Okay. Maybe you could enjoy being with Jesus' followers. I'm unsure of the power of the Spirit. Can we agree to believe in the power of love? I'm not doing a Dave Birkin trying to redefine the statement of faith. Right? All I'm saying is, when people are down in the mud, when they're on the ash heap of their life and their faith, like Job was, defining faith here, which is what they'll be doing, might actually be making things a bit harder for them. Maybe we need to build up from the base somewhere else. Rather than I can't stay here because I don't believe, maybe we can think about a bar that's a little bit lower than I have to be perfect or I just can't be. Do you know where the person sitting next to you is at? Angie, the person sitting behind you. Do you know where the person next to you is at? What phase they're in? Are they doing fine? Are they being challenged? Are they deconstructing? Are they trying to rebuild? Are they stuck in a bit of a dead-end vortex? We don't necessarily always know. Sarah was in a session at a Bible school a way back, and a person stood up and talked, and Sarah was shocked. Oh, man. She said this older sister got up. She's like, you are a dead set template, perfect, 100% faithful, Hebrews 11 kind of person. Right? And this grandmother stood up and said, I spend so much time supporting everyone else. And my faith needs help. Wouldn't have picked it. We don't necessarily know where the person next to us is at. She was challenged, she was trying to move through different phases. Pretty courageous of her to say so. Pretty useful to be able to say that too, and be in a community where people can talk about that. You know, superheroes of faith like Job, like Habakkuk, they wrestled with God. They had some pretty tough conversations with God. God's giving us permission to have those conversations with Him. And also with each other. And with each other. We want to be able to do that for the person next to us. We probably won't have the answers. We may not have the answers. Or like Job's friends, perhaps our answers are just as inadequate as Job's were. Maybe we should just sit in the ash heap and keep our mouth shut, but at least be there and not make things worse. James 5 verse 16 says that we should confess our faults to each other. Now, I don't reckon we do a great job of that, I sure don't. And we're out of time, so I'm not starting there. How should we respond when someone says their faith is challenged? Because we're a community that wants to help others develop and maintain faith, so it's pretty important we've got a good answer to that, right? How do we help people when their faith is challenged? Because it will be. We don't want to be Job's friends. That's pretty obvious. Easy answers, probably not the way. You know, God's example in Habakkuk was actually probably hard truths. I wouldn't be confident necessarily delivering those. But there was also clearly a lot of very patient love. A lot of patient love. That's what we need to find. I mean, imagine, practical example, imagine if someone rejected the resurrection of Jesus. It's not a hypothetical, because we know 1 Corinthians 15, Paul was dealing with a congregation where plenty of people did doubt the resurrection was going to happen. And in fact, slightly even more excitingly, Thomas completely rejected Jesus' resurrection. Do you remember the chapter where Thomas gets tossed out of the congregation because he didn't accept clause 1 of the Jerusalem Amended Statement of Faith that Jesus was raised? Yeah, I missed that one too. Thomas held out against the resurrection for 8 days. For 8 days, that's not long, one week and a bit. Okay, more fun. Let's just twist it another way and do some maths to sort of change it a little. 8 days, Jesus was on earth for 40 days after his resurrection. So Thomas held out against the resurrection for 20% of Jesus' time post-resurrection. Seems like a long time. The women who saw Jesus, the disciples who saw Jesus, James, didn't care. Tell me what you want. I'm not believing it. He wouldn't have anything of it. Right? Nothing got through. The only thing that got through to him was a personal intervention of Jesus. Right? And Jesus was prepared to do that. I can't get through to this person here. No one can get through to them. They're struggling. So do we toss them? Or do we bear with them and wait for Jesus to maybe make an intervention there too? How do we talk about Thomas? Doubting Thomas. That's his name. Doubting Thomas. Thomas is mentioned 3 times in the scripture. Right? John 11, Jesus says, let's go to Lazarus. Everyone goes, dumb idea, you'll get killed. Thomas says, well, let's go with him and we can die with him. John 14, he asks a follow-up question of Jesus. John 20, where he doubts, basically says, no way, Jose, on the resurrection. Right? Now, we could call him Tomo the Brave. I'm sure they probably did. But we call him Doubting Thomas. How do we respond to our mate here? Shaky Sheila? Or solid Sheila? Do we remember the history? Or the current challenge? How do we even talk or think about our friends? They might be on a downward trajectory. Do we trust that there's going to be a rebound, that Christ is going to intervene in their life? Or do we just label the Doubting Thomas piece and help make it true? Another thing we can tend to do is kind of avoid people when they've got the leprosy of doubt. No, might be catching. If only Job's Job's friends had the patience of Jesus. If only Job's friends even had the patience of Job. Reckon we could probably do better. And we know lots of examples of late bloomers. Scripturally, Jesus' family rejected him. They wanted, probably, to shut him down because they thought he was mental. It wasn't until after the resurrection that Jesus' family came to faith. And even then, Jesus had to personally appear to James. It took a miracle. Paul was born out of time. Oh, he knew his Bible backwards, but he couldn't fit Jesus into it. Not until the Lord turned his life upside down. And we know, in our congregation and elsewhere, amazing stories of people who walked out on faith and years later, out of nowhere, just come back because I want to find faith again. We need to be compassionate and understand people can be in all sorts of phases, and the timelines don't necessarily match what we would expect or hope. Just pick up and conclude with James 5. James 5 verse 15, he says more than just confess your faults. He says, confess your sins one to another. Pray for one another, that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person has great effectiveness. Job prayed for his children. I'd like to think that God gave him a pretty hot tip that prayer had been answered. Can we pray for our challenged loved ones? I bet we can. Does God hear and respond? We don't necessarily see when. We don't necessarily see where. The answer is yes. Don't even know how that always works out. But I know a few little things. However challenged their faith is, however challenged your faith, my faith is, God's good. And regardless of what I once may have thought about accountability, judgment, this, that, or the other, I know the power of a faithful prayer is going to surprise us. I suggest it's going to shock us one day. Because what we know for sure, no matter how our faith, no matter how our journey and those around us is going, God is good and God is love.